So civil society organizations and hundreds of affected tenants have signed a petition calling on the Minister of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation, Lindiwe Sisulu, to allocate and release funds that are intended for the rent relief scheme. The scheme, to the tune of about 600 million rand, is meant to provide rent relief to low-income tenants that are struggling to pay their rental as a result of the economic fallout of COVID-19. The social movements and tenants say despite repeated promises, they've yet to receive any kind of relief. For more on this, let's bring in Mpho Raboeane, who's an attorney with organization Ndifuna Ukwazi. Mpho, thanks so much for your time. It's great to have you on. This type of thing is certainly the last thing that the South Africans need, given just how widespread the economic fallout of COVID-19 has been.
That's correct. Thanks for having me, Ayanda. And you'll remember that in the beginning months of lockdown, the country's economy as well as our citizens had suffered unprecedented prejudice due to the non-economic activity. Something to the tune of 2.2 million to 3 million people had lost their jobs just in the beginning months of lockdown. So you can imagine a family in a situation where the breadwinner is no longer earning an income, or the support that they received through the UIF TRS scheme is insufficient to service things like their rent, remembering that rent constitutes or should constitute up to 30% of the household's income. So this has placed a lot of tenants in a situation where they are constantly faced with a decision between paying their rent to keep a roof over their heads and putting food and water on their table just to stay alive.
Yeah, the minister announcing the decision to allocate the funds back in July last year already. Do you know if any of the 600 million rand has actually been allocated?
So, the problem is that since that announcement in July, which also stated that there would be a policy brief or policy framework released or published 30 days thereafter, there has been no word from the minister. In fact, MPs, members of parliament in November, wrote to the minister asking whether there was any progress on the distribution of the 600 million rand and whether there was any clarity in terms of the selection criteria and number of beneficiaries the scheme stood to benefit. In her written response in November already, she said that there had been no allocation, no policy published, and there was no clarity in terms of the beneficiaries. So 8 months later, we're still in the dark about what has happened with the allocation of that 600 million.
So the trouble here may be twofold. One, the money hasn't been allocated. But two, we don't even have a framework of how it would be allocated once we find the people who need it.
That's correct. And that is quite the concern, knowing that at the end of the financial year, that fund or that funding could stand to go back to Treasury if it has been unallocated and not distributed. So that is a very concern at the forefront of everybody's minds, especially the tenants who stood to benefit from this funding relief.
Absolutely. From the work you've been able to do, have you been able to quantify how many people this type of fund would be able to assist?
So the trouble is that there are no concrete numbers about how many low-income tenants are currently in our country. But we do know that something to the tune of 350,000 people are currently renting or renting their accommodation across the country. This we know thanks to a Stats SA General Household Survey that was undertaken in 2019. But as to the number of people that stand to benefit from the scheme, that is unclear. We also need to remember that this scheme stood to benefit, according to the minister, both those in unsubsidized as well as subsidized rental housing. So that would include all the tenant beneficiaries in social housing institutions as well.
And has there been any word since the start of this petition? I mean, you know, you said that from the last time you heard, the minister herself had acceded to the fact that not even policy had been developed. But given this latest move, has there been any response from the minister herself or her office?
So we have learned through media reports coming in yesterday that the spokesperson for the minister has confirmed that there has been some movement in terms of a policy framework. They said that there would be an announcement mid-April to the effect of this. So we are yet to hear exactly what has been done, whether that allocation has been made, and how that fund will be allocated or distributed to beneficiaries. But we do now know that some movement has happened, specifically with regard to social housing institutions, where SHRA, the regulating authority over social housing institutions, has been given the duty of allocating the 300 million portion that has been allocated for those who are to benefit, who currently live in social housing institutions.
Quite unthinkable that in the interim, these South Africans are expected to continue waiting over 8 months later. It really does drive home the idea, excuse the pun, Mpho, that, you know, in many aspects, government still falls seriously short of catering to the needs of the poorest among the poor. And a pandemic hasn't changed that.
That's quite correct. The minister herself had said that her department has had to be very reactive and compassionate in their response to all these things that have been occasioned by the pandemic. But we're yet to see that caring aspect of her actions, given that throughout the lockdowns, as occasioned by the pandemic, there has been a lot of housing-related issues. We've seen a lot of people go without shelter by virtue of people disregarding the national moratorium on evictions. We've seen government itself flouting the national lockdown regulations, causing people to be homeless. And we see that despite repeated promises to people like people in Taiwan and Khayelitsha and others who have been affected during this period, the minister has not been able to deliver. Communities like Mpho Raboeane, for instance, in Khayelitsha, who spoke around this time last year with the minister and who were promised material to rebuild their homes in order to shelter and prevent the spread and transmission of COVID-19, they're still waiting for that building material to reconstruct their homes and reconstruct their lives. So we see that the minister's department does have a bit of a bad record in terms of keeping commitments. But we're also hopeful that by mid-April, there will be some clarity as to how this particular rent relief scheme will be distributed to those most in need. We also remember that the low-income tenants have been the hardest hit population.
Yeah.
And they have been the least able to service their rent. So at this moment in time, they are dependent on the goodwill of their landlords not to be thrown out onto the streets. So we are anticipating a tide of homelessness that is unprecedented and that would be more occasioned or is more likely to happen given the recent call by others to lift level 1 regulations to allow for evictions to be executed during this time.
Mpho, do you envision that the people who stand to benefit from this can actually head to court and have a watertight case against the minister, the department, given the possible implications you've just painted out for us?
There's definitely something in the legal realm that can be done. Firstly, to hold the minister accountable for her failure in terms of distributing this funding relief, should she not deliver mid-April, as has been stated and promised by her spokesperson. But secondly, because of the effects that this lockdown has had on many, which is none of their own doing, more and more people are finding themselves constituted as unlawful occupiers, which means that they now stand to be evicted in terms of the law. And the department has not done enough proactively to prevent this crossing of many innocent people into this realm of unlawful occupier. And thus, it is now at a point where if these funds are not distributed in order to both assist tenants and landlords who are in need of this relief, we will find ourselves in a situation where many people will lose their homes for lack of protection and for lack of foresight by our government.
Oh, one can only hope it doesn't get there. Mpho, thanks very much indeed. A story we'll have to keep watching quite closely. Mpho Raboeane is an attorney with organization Ndifuna Ukwazi.